Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Chapter 13 and 14. Summary Analysis. Hello and welcome to the discourse. Biographia Literaria is a seminal autobiographical work by Samuel Taylor Coleridge blending literary criticism, philosophy, and personal reflection. Often regarded as one of the most important works of English Romantic criticism, it explores the nature of poetic imagination, the principles of creative writing, and the intellectual influences that shaped Coleridge's thought. Structured in 24 chapters, the book defies easy classification, moving between memoir, aesthetic theory, and philosophical inquiry. Coleridge wrote Biographia Literaria partly in response to public misconceptions about his poetic collaboration with William Wordsworth and the principles outlined in their Lyrical Ballads. The work elaborates on Coleridge's famous distinction between fancy and imagination, presenting imagination as a vital, unifying force that transcends mechanical associations. He also critiques Wordsworth's poetic theories, particularly the idea that poetry should emulate the real language of man, while still acknowledging Wordsworth's genius. Beyond literary criticism, Biographia Literaria delves into metaphysics, drawing from German idealist philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Schelling. Coleridge explores the relationship between subjectivity and artistic creation, emphasizing the mind's active role in shaping perception. Chapters 13 and 14 of Biographia Literaria are considered particularly important for Coleridge's theories on imagination and poetry. Fancy and imagination. According to Coleridge, fancy is a superficial, mechanical mode of thought. Coleridge describes it as a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, capable only of rearranging pre-existing images and ideas through association. Unlike the unifying transformative power of imagination, fancy operates by linking fixed, discrete elements like metaphors or similes, without creating anything fundamentally new. It is the faculty behind clever wordplay, decorative imagery, and conventional verse, but it lacks the depth and vitality of imaginative art. While fancy has its place in poetry, example, light verse or ornamental language, it is subordinate to the higher, soul-stirring work of the imagination. Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, Now Lap Dogs Give Themselves the Rousing Shake, uses fancy, clever decorative metaphors, Belinda's curls as labyrinths, but no transformative vision. Fancy delights with wordplay or juxtaposition, but lacks the organic unity of imagination. The essential difference between imagination and fancy lies in their creative power. Imagination is generative, it dissolves and reintegrates perceptions into new, living wholes. Example, the symbolic depth of the rhyme of ancient mariner. Fancy, however, is combinative. It merely shuffles pre-existing elements. Example, a conventional love poem comparing a mistress to the sun. For Coleridge, this distinction separates great poetry, Shakespeare, Milton, from derivative or formulaic verse. Imagination engages the reader's soul, fancy at best amuses the intellect. Coleridge distinguishes between two levels of imagination, primary and secondary. The primary imagination is the fundamental faculty of perception, an unconscious, universal human ability through which we interpret and give meaning to the world. It is, as Coleridge describes, the living power and prime agent of all human perception, a repetition in the finite mind of God's infinite creative act. In other words, it is how we actively shape reality rather than passively receive it. In the rhyme of the ancient mariner, when the mariner perceives the sea snakes as slimy things, but later, in a moment of grace, sees them as happy living things, this shift reflects primary imagination. His fundamental way of seeing the world changes, altering reality itself for him. Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, the sounding cataract haunted me like a passion, also demonstrates primary imagination. The mind imbues natural sights with emotional and spiritual meaning. The secondary imagination, meanwhile, is the conscious artistic faculty, a heightened version of the primary imagination. It dissolves, diffuses, and recombines perceptions to create new artistic wholes, as seen in poetry and other creative works. Unlike mechanical reproduction, it is an act of will, yet it operates in harmony with deeper organic principles. For Coleridge, the secondary imagination is what distinguishes true poets from mere versifiers, as it transforms raw experience into art through a dynamic, almost mystical synthesis. Kubla Khan is a perfect example of secondary imagination. Coleridge transforms fragments of a dream into a visionary landscape, a stately plaza dome decree, where Alp, the sacred river, ran. The poem fuses disparate images, caves, rivers, music, into a mythic, organic whole. Thus, Coleridge says that unlike fancy, imagination is asemplastic, a term coined by Coleridge himself. He argues the imagination I consider as asemplastic, or a shaping and modifying power. He expands on this, distinguishing the primary unconscious perception and secondary artistic imagination, both of which are asemplastic. In Coleridge's Kubla Khan, the poem's sunny plaza dome with caves of ice unifies opposites, warm, cold, light, dark, into a single visionary symbol. Similarly, in the rhyme of the ancient mariner, the albatross transforms from a bird to a guilt-laden cross, an asemplastic fusion of nature, religion, and psychology. The egg and the eggshell. Poetic genius versus poetic talent. In Biographia Literaria, Coleridge employs the metaphor of an egg and its shell to illustrate the fundamental distinction between poetic genius and mere poetic talent. The egg, with its latent potential for life, represents the organic, creative power of the imagination, what Coleridge considers true poetic genius. Like a living egg, genuine poetic creation develops according to its own internal principles, growing into something new and vital rather than following predetermined rules. This aligns with Coleridge's concept of the asemplastic imagination, which dissolves and recreates raw materials into unified living wholes. Works like Kubla Khan exemplify these principles, where disparate images fuse into a visionary totality that feels alive and self-sustaining. The egg, then, symbolizes poetry that emerges from the deepest creative faculties, carrying within it the spark of original genius. In contrast, the eggshell stands for poetic talent alone, superficial craftsmanship without transformative power. While the shell may perfectly mimic the external form of an egg, it remains hollow, fragile, and lifeless. Coleridge compares this to verse that relies solely on fancy, which merely rearranges existing ideas without generating new meaning. Such poetry, like an empty shell or his metaphor of marble peaches, may display technical skill and decorative beauty, but fails to nourish or inspire. The eggshell represents the limitations of neoclassical poetry, where wit and adherence to formal conventions often overshadowed authentic creative vision. For Coleridge, this distinction was crucial. True art must be generative, not merely imitative. Chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria. In Chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge reflects on the origins and artistic principles behind lyrical ballads. The chapter opens with Coleridge recounting their initial discussions about the volume's purpose, revealing how their complementary yet distinct approaches shaped the collection's unique character. While Wordsworth sought to give poetic dignity to ordinary rural life through simple language, Coleridge took responsibility for crafting supernatural tales that would evoke a willing suspension of disbelief through their human interest and emotional truth. The division of labor produced the volume's distinctive blend of rustic realism and imaginative wonder, exemplified by works like Wordsworth's The Idiot Boy and Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Coleridge uses this chapter to carefully examine and ultimately critique Wordsworth's famous preface to Lyrical Ballads, particularly its advocacy for poetry written in the real language of man. While acknowledging Wordsworth's genius, Coleridge disputes the notion that rustic speech inherently possesses greater poetic virtue. He argues that the language of peasants, though sincere, is often limited in vocabulary and range of expression, and that true poetic diction necessarily involves selection and refinement. For Coleridge, Wordsworth's own best poems belie this theoretical stance, as they frequently employ language more elevated than actual peasant speech. This tension between theory and practice leads Coleridge to question whether Wordsworth's concept of poetic language is either accurate or desirable as a universal principle. The chapter also explores their differing attitudes toward poetic meter, another point of theoretical divergence between the two poets. While Wordsworth viewed meter as essentially artificial, Coleridge defended its organic relationship to poetry's emotional power. He argues that meter arises naturally from the heightened state of emotion that poetry expresses, serving not as decoration but as an essential expressive element. Coleridge suggests that meter creates a balance of pleasure that tempers painful or powerful subjects, allowing readers to experience intense emotions without being overwhelmed. The willing suspension of disbelief. Samuel Taylor Coleridge introduces the famous phrase willing suspension of disbelief to explain how readers engage with imaginative literature, particularly works involving the supernatural. Coleridge argues that successful supernatural fiction does not require literal belief but rather a temporary, conscious acceptance of its reality for the sake of emotional and aesthetic engagement. Coleridge's idea directly contrasts with Wordsworth's focus on realism in Lyrical Ballads. While Wordsworth sought poetry in ordinary life, Coleridge argued that the supernatural could be equally powerful if framed with enough artistry to trigger suspension of disbelief. The audience voluntarily sets aside skepticism not because they are deceived, but because they chose to engage imaginatively. This differs from naive belief or delusion. It is a collaborative act between the writer and reader. The work must provide enough human interest, psychological realism, or internal consistency to feel plausible. In the rhyme of Ancient Mariner, the mariner's guilt and redemption make the supernatural elements, cursed albatross, ghostly ship, emotionally credible. Coleridge compares this suspension to religious faith, not blind belief, but a leap into symbolic meaning. The supernatural becomes a vehicle for deeper truths, moral, psychological, or spiritual themes. In Coleridge's Christabel, Geraldine's ambiguous supernatural nature, vampire, demon, works because her psychological manipulation of Christabel feels eerily human. Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief does not mean credulity, but rather a conscious, temporary agreement to engage with art on its own terms. It explains why humans can weep over fictional characters, fear imaginary monsters, or marvel at impossible worlds, all while knowing they are unreal. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a scientist reanimates dead tissue to create life. Shelley grounds the story in scientific ambition and human emotion, making Frankenstein's obsession and the creature's suffering feel authentic despite the implausible premise. Similarly, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series shows a hidden world of wizards, magic spells, and mythical creatures. The detailed rules of magic, wand lore, potions, etc., and relatable school life dynamics make the fantasy world internally consistent and believable. Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief and Aristotle's concept of catharsis both explore how audiences engage emotionally with art, though they focus on different aspects of the experience. In his Poetics, Aristotle describes catharsis as the purgation or purification of emotions, particularly pity and fear, through tragedy, allowing spectators to experience these feelings in a controlled, aesthetic context before returning to reality with a renewed emotional balance. Similarly, Coleridge's suspension of disbelief involves a temporary, conscious acceptance of fictional realities, enabling audiences to fully immerse themselves in a story's emotional and imaginative world. Both concepts hinge on the audience's voluntary participation. Aristotle's catharsis requires viewers to invest emotionally in characters' plights, while Coleridge's suspension demands an openness to unreal scenarios. However, while catharsis emphasizes the outcome of emotional engagement, a release or refinement of feelings, suspension of disbelief focuses on the process, how audiences initially bypass skepticism to enter a fictional world. Both, though, acknowledge art's power to shape psychological responses, whether through a visceral impact of tragedy, Aristotle, or the imaginative absorption in the unreal, Coleridge. Together, they highlight how storytelling relies on a pact between creator and audience, where emotional truth transcends literal reality. So this is it for today. We will continue to discuss the history of English literature and concepts of literary criticism. Please stay connected with the discourse. Thanks and regards.